Hi, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist, and I work in Southern Vermont.
My name is Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, a licensed mental health counselor. And this is our guest this evening, David Gartenstein, who's state's attorney, right?
I'm a deputy state's attorney here in Windham County. I've been working at the state's attorney's office for now 10.5 years. I work prosecuting serious criminal cases, serious felony cases, and other matters. And I'm chair of the Brattleboro Select Board as well.
Yeah, great. Well, welcome to our show.
All right.
And we'll get to that.
Yeah, and we've been bringing people into the studio from the community. We had the school superintendent and the police chief in previous weeks, and wanted David in as well because there are so many different sort of authorities in the area and in the state that work with and coordinate mental health care and services. So we wanted to find out how your office is involved in that.
Before we go there, do you want to give them how to get in touch with us?
Oh, sure. So we have a Facebook page as well as an email address. At Facebook, it's facebook.com/letstalkvt. And the email address is questions@letstalkvt.com, and that is the correct address. The address that was on some previous flyers is not the right address. It will send you to a site that is not ours. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So one of the reasons that we asked you, at least I wanted to ask you to have you on the show, is to talk a little bit about the effect of the interface, if you will, between the criminal justice system and the mentally ill and the and I've said this before the show. You know, we had a person on, I think it was last year, and he made the point that at one point they decided to deinstitutionalize folks, and that was fine. I mean, there was places that needed to be sort of looked at. But he said, on the other hand, what's happened, though, is that many of these folks have now gone into another institution, otherwise known as jail. And not all of them, but some of them. And so I guess I would like to start there, if you don't mind. How do you see the role of the criminal justice system as far as treating people with mental illness in our community?
Well, Robert, the point you make about deinstitutionalization and then people being moved into other institutions has some real truth to it. The jails house people who've engaged in criminal conduct, but there's also a significant population of people within the correctional centers who are suffering from mental illness and who have substance abuse issues that are fueling their behavior. And so we've seen in the last year or two a substantial push by the Department of Corrections to try to provide better treatment programs in the jail, particularly those to address substance abuse and people with serious functional impairments. And it's really important, I think, for us to recognize those co-occurring type of disorders in order to try to help people get back on track and get better prepared to make their way back into the community.
Now, you said earlier, and I put you on the spot, but you were talking about what are some of the things that when you think about a criminal justice system, what are some of the things that you take a look at when you're looking at a client? And not only that, but what is the purpose of what you're doing?
All right, so I work at the state's attorney's office, and when the police investigate whether a crime has been committed, if they conclude a crime has been committed, they'll prepare paperwork, forward it to the state's attorney's office. We do another layer of review. If we believe a crime has been committed, we prepare charging documents, file them in criminal court. Defendant's brought in for arraignment. The case goes through trial preparation, and then we work to see if an admission of guilt can be reached and an agreement can be reached about a sentence. And really the goal of sentencing is to try to make sure that people are equipped with the skills that they need not to reoffend, to try to reduce the risk of recidivism. So rehabilitation is one important goal of the criminal justice system, but there's other goals as well. I work on very serious cases. I've tried probably 2.5 dozen sex assault cases involving kids, a lot of intra-family sexual abuse. I've worked homicide cases, other felony cases. So there's a legitimate role that's played for punishment and for deterrence, and also, in some cases, incapacitation.
And I guess what the point I'm trying to get to is that one of the things we do when I used to work with clients, and the question was, is this a case of they can't help it or they won't do it? In other words, is this a voluntary action? And I wonder about how you tease that out. I mean, when someone says, like a first DWI, you say, it was an accident, I didn't realize I had too much to drink. But what about the second and third DWI? I mean, at some point, somebody says, well, I'm an alcoholic, and that's why this has happened. But yet you have to make decisions based on the number of offenses. And could you say something about that,
Right.
how that works?
Well, exactly what's motivating an offender when they commit a crime sometimes can be very difficult to distinguish. There can be elements of what's going on in our life. There can be substance abuse. There can be history of violence. All the factors of what somebody's lived with generally bring them to the place where they're committing a crime. And we try, when a sentence is being structured, to provide the Department of Corrections with the tools that they need to be able to work with that offender going forward in order to give them the foundation and the skills so that they can live a productive life within the community without reoffending. Now, there can be a combination, right, of whether somebody couldn't help it or somebody engaged in the conduct intentionally. I worked DUI 1 cases. I've also worked a DUI 9 case. And there's a difference between the person who's driving drunk because alcoholism is a disease and the person who keeps driving drunk, not taking the steps to avoid creating that risk. And then we're dealing with behavior when we get to a DUI 3 or DUI 6 or a DUI 9, somebody who continually is disregarding the risk that they're creating to others. And there's an argument to be made that those types of crimes need to be dealt with differently.
Yeah, I mean, we often think about with addiction, for example, and then what we call antisocial personality disorder, which is just really a disregard for social norms, which oftentimes people start out with that sort of problem and then develop addiction problems versus sort of the other way around of addiction comes first, and then the appearance of not following norms or, as you said, sort of criminal behaviors that are associated with one's addiction.
Addiction certainly plays a role in a lot of the crime that we see, and mental illness plays a role in some of the crime that we see as well. And we're working in the criminal justice system to balance out all those factors and try to develop consequences and results that work to make all of us safer and to provide appropriate consequences while really, maintaining the social compact. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had the police chief on, and he brought the social worker with him, and talked about using the social worker sort of to help with the clients and talk with them and do follow-up with them. And you mentioned earlier, before the show, some of the other things that are coming up in the court system, some of the other alternatives or different approaches. I wonder if you want to say a little bit about that, even if it's sort of in the planning stage. Right. But still,
there's a number of different programs that we're working on within the criminal justice system in an effort to make sure that we're as responsive as possible to the role of substance abuse and mental illness in the system. So I had the opportunity last year to participate in the serious functional impairment work group that was set up by the legislature, and we were looking at the impact of mental illness on those who are already within the jails and within the correctional population. At the front end of the system, there's a whole range of programs that are being developed to try to divert low-level offenders out of the system, hopefully so that they don't even have to reach arraignment, and so that issues that can be dealt with out of the criminal justice system will be dealt with out of the criminal justice system. So there's a program here. I think you reminded me of the acronym CRAFT here in Windham County, where the former police chief is now partnering with the state's attorney's office to meet with offenders in low-level crimes. And if there's the possibility of them participating in treatment over a 9-month period and addressing the risk areas that brought them into the system, then the charges will be resolved that way without the need for any further interaction with the justice system. And then there are specialized court programs as well that are being developed. So we have drug court, we have DUI courts, and we also have the new intensive domestic violence court here in Windham County. Each of those programs are meant to provide that structure where there's going to be as immediate a consequence as possible for the conduct and for relapse. And I know, Robert, you were speaking earlier about the importance of immediate consequences in recovery.
Yeah, one of the things, and there's some research that indicates it's true, that, you know, if somebody wanted to maintain abstinence and they slip and they use alcohol or drugs, a lot of times they don't get caught. I mean, unless you're incredibly, you know, and so that sort of allows sometimes people to negotiate and do more and do it again, and sort of disprove the idea, well, I can drink safely. And so one of the theories around some research was that if you can in some way have immediate consequences when somebody relapses, when somebody does something, and not in a mean way, not to punish, like, you know, but more like a heads up. Yeah. You know, you really made another poor choice. This was a bad decision. There's a consequence, and one of the things that we talked about was a shorter stay in the jail. In other words, like a 3-day stay or 2-day.
Like in Hawaii, the drug court started this a number of years ago, but the idea was not just an immediate consequence, but immediate and appropriate consequence. Right. So, you know, oftentimes what happened was there'd be a relapse, a drug screen would show, you know, marijuana, their conditions were don't do that, and that would go on for 3, 4, 5 times, and then finally they said, look, aren't you listening to this? You're going to jail for, you know, 3 months. You violated your conditions. And what they started doing in Hawaii was the first time there's something in a drug screen, it was more or less like, I hope you have your toothbrush in your back pocket because you're spending the next 2 days in jail. So the word got around that right away. There was going to be a reasonable effect. It was going to be just a couple of days for that offense, and they started to see less and less violations of the conditions, less and less drug use happening because they knew the terms.
And so the DUI court and the drug court are based upon bringing people back into the courthouse regularly and monitoring their progress on a weekly basis. The Department of Corrections also has been relying more on graduated sanctions to try to deal with behavior that violates conditions of probation quickly and in a proportionate manner that doesn't involve returning right to court for a formal violation of probation.
Now, one of the things that I've seen, and I'm not sure how I should feel about this. You know, I work as a volunteer at Bridget's Kitchen, and some of the folks that come in get in trouble, and that we've talked about this. There seems to be this interplay between poverty and crime. And it's like when you see somebody getting arrested for shoplifting, and it's more than once, more than twice. Is it, you know, are they shoplifting food, or, you know? And yet I know there are store owners in town that really, shoplifters are their bane. I mean, really, it takes the whole profit away. They get very angry. Do you ever run into that where some people say, we want punishment. We want, you know, people will be arrested and prosecuted, and then other people saying, well, you know, this is hardship. You said it earlier. You said something about the person is not a criminal. He's engaged in criminal behavior. Could you say more?
I see it at different levels of crime.
Yeah.
I had to open up a folder over the weekend for a defendant who's now got 7 different low-level criminal cases. Shoplifting, stealing $100, stealing food, stealing coins and the like. And it's very difficult to tell whether that pattern of criminal conduct is the result of poverty, is the result of substance abuse, is the result of mental illness, is the result of just poor choices in the person's life. It exists there, but it also exists in much more significant cases. The federal government in the last 2 years hasn't really been prosecuting bank robbery cases. And so I've handled a series of bank robbery cases in the last 2 years. And so we've had bank robberies in Brattleboro 2 or 3 and up in Bellows Falls. And the factors that have led people to commit those really serious crimes until a very recent one seem very substantially to be substance abuse. People are looking to fuel their habits. And so they're going in and trying to rob banks to steal money to do that. And we then are faced with this balance that needs to be drawn, because we've got somebody who's got a real substance abuse problem, but then they've committed a crime that just can create way substantial violence and harm to people. I mean, it's such a dangerous thing to walk into a store or walk into a bank and say, I've got a gun, give me the money. People need to feel safe, you know, when they go to the convenience store, when they go to the bank, when they go to the gas station. And we have to work out sentences in cases like this that balance both the risk that an individual offender is facing from substance abuse and mental illness and poverty against the risk of harm that they create in the community as a whole. It's a difficult business.
Oh yeah, and I bet it's the same as we run into sometimes.
I mean, I'm being struck by how many similarities are between what we do here.
Really.
It's like, you know, what's sort of the cause, what's the effect? Talking about, you know, no wrong door, it sounds like, you know, we're trying to funnel people the rest for the mental health treatment. You know, Mike Fitzgerald was here, and what he was talking about, their work sort of kind of decreased criminality, getting mental health the right conduit. It sounds like, David, you're doing the same thing through the state's attorney's office, and we're dealing with people who are sort of outside the norm of behavior, whether it's by schizophrenia or addiction. You know, that it's then too trying to sort of change those behaviors to become more within the norm. So it sounds like in that way we have a lot of similarities in our various works.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the problems I have is that, and this happens all the time to me, and when I was working that, you can have an image of what you think a person is, and then well, here's what they did, and here's the crime they should have, and you know, it's like whack, you know, no question about it. Then you meet the person, you know, and then you talk to the person, and then you find out more about the person, you find out their history, you find out all these other things, and all of a sudden it humanizes them, you know what I mean? They're not like, well, he's not a criminal, like you said. It's a criminal behavior, and you have to look at that. But I mean, it's sort of, I wonder how you deal with this. There must be a push from people who don't know the individual that says, we need to punish this person. And we need to punish him in a way that, you know, gets people's attention. I saw it in the paper the other day about bringing Vermont prisoners who are out of state, bringing them into the state. Now, I have to admit, there's been times when I said to myself, somebody who's selling 1,000 bags of heroin in Vermont, they should forfeit the right to live in Vermont. You understand? This is, no, really, like, you know, I don't even want you waking up in Vermont, you know. On the other hand, I read these stories from mothers who were saying, you know, I want to connect with the family. I want them to be there. Yeah, and I had that moment, and you must run into that, like in the public, like people who don't know want more, or people who, you know what I mean? It's not just a wishy-washy liberal thing. It's knowing the person.
Well, I've worked cases involving victims, and I mean, I really understand the pressures that lead to large sentences and to the call for really substantial sentences. I mean, I've worked with families where there's been a killing, right? And it's been a killing that's been perpetrated by a neighbor or by a family member or by a coworker, right? And the damage that's caused by criminal conduct is something that has to be dealt with through the criminal justice system, right? And there's an approach that we've developed through millennia of civilization that involves the jails, and that's in part the response that we give. But on the other hand, we need to balance our work consistently to make sure that we're aware of the need for rehabilitation, the need to develop structures so that people who've committed criminal conduct are equipped with the skills that they need to reintegrate into the community. And that's part of what you were talking about with people sent out of state, right? At the Select Board last week, we were asked to approve the grant funding from the Department of Corrections to the Restorative Justice Center here in Brattleboro that runs the Circles of Support and Accountability. And the goal of that program is to make sure that people who have committed serious crimes, and we're talking mostly about crimes of sexual assault, when they are being released from the jail, that they've got a circle of community members who are there to work with them, to hold them accountable if they're minimizing their conduct, but also to facilitate their transition back into the community. Because in almost every case, no matter how long the minimum sentence, in almost every case, people are ultimately going to be transitioning back to the community from which they committed the crime in the first place.
Now, you, and I don't know if you want to get into this, but I know both of you have had training in involuntary admissions. And last year, I think it was, we had someone on here talking about what it takes to get people in the hospital. I don't know if you remember this, but there was this whole argument about whether or not it's too onerous of a process to involuntary when they really need to go in. And they did change some of the laws, I think, the legislature. Has anything else about that come up, or any?
That sort of switches topics a little bit from the criminal justice system into the mental health system, but I do work in the mental health care system as well. I'm the prosecutor who handles all of the juvenile involuntary mental health commitment cases for the state, because children are only involuntarily committed at the retreat, except for very short periods now under new legislation at emergency rooms. Since Tropical Storm Irene, we've been working in the state of Vermont with a real shortage of involuntary treatment beds for mental health patients. So the Vermont State Hospital was damaged by the flood, and a new facility was constructed and opened. The standard really remains the same under the law. So if a person is mentally ill, and as a result poses risk of harm to self or others, and the hospital is the least restrictive environment where they can be safely maintained, then that person qualifies for hospitalization. And that standard was the same before and after Irene, but now there's less beds. So people have been hospitalized for mental illness much more in the last 3 years in emergency rooms. And that's really sort of created a crisis in the mental health system.
Has that happened in Vermont?
Oh yeah. And so there's been a change in the law as part of the recent legislation that changed the process a little bit for involuntary medication proceedings. The law also now requires that when somebody is hospitalized based upon mental illness at an emergency room and involuntary hospitalization, that court involvement happen right away. Because it wasn't happening right away previously. And so the new legislation requires the emergency exam application to be filed promptly after somebody is admitted into the ER. And that's another step in making sure that there's judicial oversight over the mental health system.
Is it different for adults and juveniles?
The procedures are the same.
Are the same.
I think one of the unintended consequences that we're seeing really just in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the change in the law is that not just are adults now being admitted into emergency rooms, And adults sometimes wind up staying in emergency rooms for long periods of time before a bed opens up at a hospital, but kids as well. So I've had 2 involuntary commitment cases recently in the last 3 weeks where kids were involved and were admitted first into emergency rooms, and then the cases were transferred to Brattleboro when the child was transferred to the retreat.
And the purpose, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, you asked if they were happening here, and I know that at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, they've had some cases of people being in the ER for 3 weeks, even 4 weeks, so
right.
It is happening locally, too.
And the idea is to get them help.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think sometimes people sort of miss that idea because involuntary doesn't sound really good. But the idea, you want to get them well. You want to get them help, and sometimes
Totally.
Anyways,
the purpose of the mental health care system is to provide treatment and then deinstitutionalize, and that's where we started this discussion.
Yeah.
Almost a half hour ago, and that is the goal. I know in the part of the practice that I work, which involves kids, the length of the stay at a facility, the mental health facility, is generally very, very short, because the goal is to stabilize. And with the use of medications, stabilization often happens very quickly, and then to return the child to a home or a community-based safe environment. And that's really the goal of that mental health care system.
Yeah.
That's great. I wonder if, because we are coming to the
Yeah.
end here, one of the things I'd like to ask, if you don't mind,
Sure.
is just in your own experience as a lawyer working for the state, everything, the progress of a different way that we treat people. I mean, a different, maybe not just DWIs, and because that's really changed over the years, but just in general, the progress that we've made in how we approach mental illness in the system and how people look at it now. You want to make a remark on that, or some thoughts about that? And where do you think we'll go from here?
When I started prosecuting about 10.5 years ago, substance abuse treatment in the jails was really very, very thin. And it was really unfortunate. And there's been a real improvement, I think, in the last year or two in trying to make sure that risk reduction programming is available in the jails, and that the focus of community-based supervision after somebody is convicted is risk reduction programming. That's really our goal. I think the time is upon us where continuing improvements in the mental health care system are also needed. There's been a change in the system since the Vermont State Hospital closed, and there are huge pressures from what I see in my practice on the mental health care system that continue to present a real challenge. And we look forward to improvements in the mental health care system in the state of Vermont, to making sure there's adequate funding for that system and making sure that people are receiving the services that they need. We've seen improvements in Department of Corrections. We certainly look forward to seeing those in Department of Mental Health as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
Listen.
I mean, do you feel like Vermont, being sort of a smaller state, access to people, that we're trendsetters in this area, like folks have said about opiate treatment?
It's hard to say. The funding for mental health care, from what I can see, is something that's sort of under attack. And it's not clear to me, based upon where I sit at the state's attorney's office, that there's really adequate support services for the mentally ill, and that there's adequate structures. There are real fundamental structural defects in the relationship between the criminal justice system and the mental health care system that haven't really been addressed, that aren't really the proper topic for discussion now, since I think we're running out of time, but it's something for us to work on going forward.
Thank you very much.